Okay, we're going to resume with today's presentation, and for the next one we're going to have Tom Andres, and he is the Assistant State Structures Design Engineer, and he's going to talk to us about the design build, and he's got very interesting points to cover this afternoon. Tom?
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I got quite a bit to cover this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about design build. The first topic I'm going to talk about is going to discuss the rewrite of the structures manual for design build and the status of the PPM rewrite that's currently going on. That PPM rewrite is due to be published in July of this year. Then next I'm going to talk about the new design bulletin that will be issued in the next few weeks. This design bulletin provides direction to all design build project phase reviewers. The bulletin is currently being reviewed by the statewide alternative task team, and as soon as they get their comments finalized, we'll be issuing it, and I'll go through what's entailed in that bulletin. Item number 3 is really more about the general training on design build. It's design build frequently asked questions. In addition to questions that are specific to general philosophy, it also gets into our procurement process and why we do what we do. And then afterward, it talks about, again, some of our design build philosophy and why our policies are the way they are. So I think you'll get a lot out of the discussion, although at the beginning the questions are pretty general, but it really does drill down on some of the questions. On item number 4, this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to me. It talks about, or what I will be discussing is how to write a flexible RFP. You know, we've done probably 100 or so design build, probably more, and we've learned a lot about best practices regarding how to write an RFP, and I'm going to cover some of those today. So with that, let's go. Also, I do want to point out that I'm going to be also giving the same training on March 19th at 9 a.m. as part of the Engineering Academy series. And Jackie Morris will be sending out an invitation. So if there's stuff that I talk about today that you think other folks in your firm or other folks in the district might be interested in, please let them know. But I will be talking, repeating, if you will, what I'm going to cover today. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Let me spend a little time briefing you on our recent structures manual rewrite for design build, which was published last month. Then at the end, I will address where we are in our current PPM rewrite, which, like I said, is due to be completed in July. Many of the specific items that I cover in this presentation for the structures manual rewrite will also apply to the PPM rewrite. First of all, the new structures manual has been written to address 2 primary audiences. The first audience is the engineer, the EOR for a conventional job. And then the second audience is the EOR for the design build or P3 project. Also, I note that there's a list of pre-scoping questions which have been developed to assist the author of the RFP in developing the project constraints. More on that later. I should point out that the PPM also has a 4th audience, which is the EOR during the PD&E process. And lastly, the structures design guidelines also includes an additional audience as well, because a new chapter has been added specific to the contractor specialty engineer. But in general, the structures manual has 2 primary audiences, as I mentioned above. The format of this structures manual rewrite includes a modification box immediately after the text to be modified. In this example, the black text with the white background is is intended to apply to all projects except where modified by the blue modification box. In this example, section SDG 422C is being deleted and replaced with the text in the blue box. See the end of the modification text that states, unless otherwise indicated in the RFP. This indicates that a pre-scoping question has been added asking the author of the RFP whether, in this case, a half-inch sacrificial deck thickness would be included in the widening section to facilitate profilographing and deck planing. Note also the definition for non-conventional projects. This includes design, build, and P3 jobs. The description of how the modification boxes are to be used is located in the introduction section of the manual. See the link circled in red on the left side of the structure's manual start page there. It's a little hard to find. That's the reason I'm pointing it out. So, okay, the sort of structure manual language that we're exempting out. Number one, design requirements based on assumed material properties or the availability of materials is one example. Design requirements based on assumed equipment capabilities is another. Or design requirements based on efficient fabrication, construction processes, or practices is also another example of language that we exempt out for design, build, or P3. Okay, here's some other examples. Of course, we would exempt out pay item and bidability requirements. Also, we're exempting out language which requires the EOR to contact the FDOT for guidance during the final design based on specific situations. As I mentioned earlier, these situations would have a pre-scoping questions to aid the RFP developer to make sure that those requirements get put in the RFP. Okay, here are two examples of where design direction is geared towards the availability of materials and allowing options. The first example is about accommodating both hot and cold rolled shapes. The second example is about the availability of the rolled shapes specified. The point is that on a design, build, and P3 job, that it is up to the design, build firm or concessionaire to ensure that everything works. So these availability requirements are not required on design, build. Now, I might point out, just because we exempt it out as a requirement doesn't mean it might be good practice. So the design, build EOR might, of course, check the availability of the section that he's working with the design, build firm on. You know, so just to be clear, just because we exempt it out don't mean that it's not good practice. Okay, here's an example of where resistance limits for pile driving are specified for various pile sizes based on typical driving equipment. In design build, these limits are necessary because the proof is in the pudding. He's got to show that his stress limits and all of those sorts of things and his PDA are being met, etc. So the proof is in the pudding. All right, here's an example of where we specify maximum column lift heights and detailing requirements to accommodate these maximum lift heights. Again, for design, build, or P3 jobs, this is not necessary. The design build firm is responsible for making sure that the forming system used is designed for the hydrostatic pressures. So again, in keeping with design build philosophy, this would be exempted out. And he would be forced to show that it works in the actual project application. Okay, here's one more example. Here's an example of where we exempt out scour design for temporary structures unless otherwise directed by the department. For design build, we have added a pre-scoping question, and as you can see, the modification in the blue box says see the RFP. So this slide shows the design build boilerplate language. The first thing you will see at the top is the link to the pre-scoping questions. You will also find a link to the pre-scoping questions on the construction website, and in the introduction to the structures manual at the link that I previously showed you, which is there on the left-hand side of the slide there. Here is the format of the old pre-scoping questions. And here is the new format of the pre-scoping questions, which were posted in January 2013, last month. Note the first column refers to the governing regulation reference. The second column gives a fairly concise pre-scoping question. For instance, the first question here involves whether the site has seagrasses and gives associated construction access and permit-related constraints that may need to be included in the RFP. You know, things related to turbidity and that sort of thing. The third column specifies the FDOT responsible contact that needs to be involved. This is usually the FDOT discipline expert in that area. We have found these questions to be excellent for developing RFP constraints. We have also found these questions excellent for reviewing draft RFP documents. And quite frankly, my guys, when we review an RFP, this is probably the first place that we start as we go back to the pre-scoping questions to make sure that all the constraints are there. We are currently expanding these pre-scoping questions as part of the PPM rewrite. So you're going to see a lot more roadway-related questions in the near future. And I expect that that rewrite is going to be published in July with the PPM manual. Lastly, I repeat that the PPM changes for design build will be very similar to what you see in the structures manual. And thanks to our district support, these changes are on track for July 2013 publication. Okay, I'm going to change gears here on you. And we're going to talk a little bit about the new direction for design build and 3P project phase reviewers. We will be issuing a joint design bulletin / DCE directive in the very near future to all design build and public-private partnership project phase reviewers. In the future, all reviewers will be required to separate component review comments to those comments that do and comments that do not refer to direct violations of the contract as follows. Comments that do refer to direct violations of the contract require a written response by the design build firm or concessionaire. Where possible, the reviewer is expected to include specific contract reference or requirement that is being violated in the comment. Comments that do not refer to direct violations of the contract do not require a written response by the design build firm or concessionaire. At the end of each comment, state that a written response is not required and that the comment is included for information only. Here is an example of a comment that is a direct violation of the contract where a written response by the design build firm or concessionaire is required. In this example, the vertical curve length does not meet the minimum requirements of PPM Volume 1, Table 285. So there you go. It's pretty straightforward. Direct violation is being denoted in the comment with the reference. Here is an example of a comment that is not a direct violation of the contract and which does not require a written response by the design build firm or concessionaire. This comment says, the plans as submitted depict a 4-span steel unit to be constructed from the outer spans inward. The last field splice over I-95 may be difficult to fit up within the 30-minute window depicted in the traffic control restrictions as required in the RFP. Recommend constructing the steel unit from the center outward or from the center outward or from end to end. This comment is for information only and a written response is not required. In this example, the intent of the comment is that the 30-minute maximum I-95 closure window is enforceable per the contract, no matter what action the design build firm takes in response to the comment. The reviewer here is just putting the design build firm on notice. The policy of separating design build and P3 comments has been followed successfully for many years now in various disciplines and in various districts. The main reason for instituting this new policy is to better clarify the deficiencies that needs to be corrected, avoid arbitrary comments and comments related to reviewer preferences, which have to be responded to and are typically difficult to resolve, perform more concise, focused reviews, improve RFP language and governing regulation, for example, the PPM and the SDG language over time. So we believe that this policy will actually improve our governing documents over time. Okay, switching gears here. I'm going to go through some design build frequently asked questions. Question number 1. What benefits does the design build procurement method offer to the department? Early contractor involvement in the design process enables construction engineering considerations to be incorporated into the design. Also, constructability issues can be better addressed. Design build also accelerates the project schedule due to overlapping the design and construction activities, but there is also an acceleration in project schedule due to the FHWA authorization process. Other benefits. In general, design-build procurement offers greater flexibility in project financing methods. In fact, most of our P3 jobs utilize design-build procurement method, but not all. Design-build allows for innovative project solutions that are uniquely fashioned by project needs and contractors' capabilities and equipment. No question about that. In general, from the department's perspective, there is a reduction in potential claims and litigations. Issues are resolved by members of the design-build firm. It allows a reduction in project costs by optimizing the design construction solution. No question. Okay. Question number 2. What is the department's design-build philosophy? Our design-build philosophy is based on the following core principles. The acknowledgement that there are multiple acceptable solutions to most complex transportation problems. If you haven't realized this fact in the past few years on design-build jobs, you really haven't been paying attention. A well-written RFP establishes critical project requirements and constraints, and at the same time allows maximum flexibility to encourage innovative solutions that will result in substantial cost savings. FDOT's philosophy also acknowledges that although there will be less department control in directing project solution than exists on conventional projects, we trust that through the enforcement of a well-written RFP, along with a rigorous design-build procurement process, that a superior final product at a reduced cost will emerge in the end. We believe that a fair and competitive procurement process allows the design-build teams to compete for projects on a level playing field, resulting in the most cost-effective transportation solution. And if there's one thing that I want you to remember to take away from today's training above all else, remember that design-build is not about cutting corners to save a penny. It is about developing superior, comprehensive transportation solutions that save millions of dollars. Okay, moving on. Question 3. I have been asked to write a design-build RFP. Where do I start? Answer. Standardized design-build contract documents, rules, procedures, and guidelines are located at the FDOT Construction Office website. See URL link below. The FDOT has developed standard boilerplate language to be used as a starting point. Included in the boilerplate are notes to the RFP developer regarding project-specific content that should be inserted, as well as the requirements related to RFP reviews. And that's kind of specific to the scope of the job. But that direction is in the boilerplate. Question number 4, what is a project constraint? A project constraint is a requirement conveyed in the RFP that defines the limitations or functional requirements that must be satisfied in the delivered project. A project constraint is not simply a description of the concept plans. Rather, a constraint defines the underlying framework from which the project solutions can be developed. Okay. In general, project constraints can be classified into 5 different categories. Requirements dictated by project stakeholders. Examples, there's a lot of these, but examples include aesthetics, requirements regarding utility owners, requirements regarding airport glide paths and FAA coordination. And a lot of these are adjacent property owners, etc. Other types of constraints are required as a result of site conditions or surveys. These may include containment due to lead-based paint that may exist, turbidity and access requirements when you have seagrasses, site and environmental classifications for setting concrete covers and mixes, etc. Other types of constraints are governing documents referenced in the RFP, including things like the structures manual, the PPM, and or the AASHTO design codes. This also may include whether or not there's whether the RFP attachments are attached for information or attachments regarding requirements, and how you attach the document is really important here. Project-specific requirements not covered in existing FDOT design references or AASHTO codes can sometimes need some additional guidance. I know, for instance, we had the airport runway in Fort Lauderdale where we were landing planes on it, where we had to develop a design criteria that did not exist. Same thing happened on the high-speed rail, where we had to develop design criteria for high-speed rail that didn't exist in the U.S. Those are some examples. Okay. Question number 5. What are pre-scoping questions? I covered this in my earlier presentation. Suffice it to say that pre-scoping questions are a tool to aid in establishing project constraints to be included in the RFP. Question number 6. What are some useful strategies for writing an effective RFP? I will be covering this in much more detail in a separate presentation later. In general, effective RFPs are written such that all project requirements and constraints are clearly presented in a way that promotes design construction flexibility. They also specify objective analysis techniques to be used in evaluating traffic operational differences between technical proposals. Establishing evaluation criteria and weighting the evaluation criteria to reflect the relative importance of various project solutions is also important. For instance, traffic impacts and utility impacts may be very important on a job, say in Miami, but these issues might be less important, say, on a rural project in District 3. So how you weight and which evaluation criteria you include in your RFP is really important so that you get what you want. FDOT staffing during design build procurement needs to account for the need to evaluate the various project solutions during procurement. That's an important factor. And the more complicated and bigger the project, the more those resources are going to have to be. Question number 7. What are some possible pitfalls in writing an RFP? Writing a well-written RFP is very difficult. It is not as simple as downloading the boilerplate and filling in the project description. If you want to ensure that you get what you want, you have to give the RFP the attention it deserves. Another pitfall that I see fairly common is not properly defining the full build-out for the project. And I should point out that just because your project does not have an ultimate section does not mean that the RFP should not address future requirements. You know, we're in a growth state, and we need to make sure that we're looking long-term here. Another pitfall is being overly restrictive. More on that topic later. Other pitfalls is not properly defining all the project constraints. This is a biggie. But for projects that have been in development for many years, reassessing prior commitments and constraints is a very important step. You need to revisit these periodically to see if they're still valid. On that point, not remembering why you did what you did when you developed the concept plans is a big problem. And that's especially difficult on jobs that are originally conventional that get moved over into design build. Okay? And especially if the job has been in development for a long time. Another pitfall is being too prescriptive, except where you have to be. And I'll be talking about this one in more detail in the next presentation. Question number 8. What are some effective strategies for reviewing draft RFPs? When we are reviewing draft RFPs, we like to use a reverse engineering process. Here's how the process works. At about 90% draft stage, we form a small multidiscipline team. Prior to meeting, all the members review the draft RFP and the concept plans. Then we put ourselves in the shoes of a prospective design build firm. What would we do differently to reduce costs or add value? And then we ask ourselves, is that acceptable? And if so, we don't take any action. But if the solution is not acceptable, we modify the RFP to disallow it. I want to point out here that, of course, this process does not have to be performed in a group. Each reviewer can utilize this process individually, and in fact, this is a very good way of looking at reviewing the RFP. Question number 9. What if several proposals have non-conforming items or minor irregularities in their technical proposal? The procurement process allows for evaluators and technical advisors to ask clarifying questions of all technical proposals during the Q&A meeting. As part of the Q&A meeting, the department can issue a written list of minor irregularities and non-conforming items to each team to address in writing prior to bid. The design build firm has to respond in writing indicating how each item will be corrected. And the design build firm has to clearly indicate that the correction will be included in the bid. Question number 10. Can the commitments made in the technical proposal be changed after award? The technical proposal is a book of promises, and commitments made in the technical proposal are legally binding. And in fact, those commitments are part of the best value bid, right? Yeah, they are. A cost savings initiative clause has been added to all design build projects. This is just fairly recent. And the reason we've added this CSI clause is we were finding that design build firms were making changes after award that were not consistent with commitments made in their best value technical proposal. They called the changes simply design refinements, but we disagreed. There were cases where the design build firms came up with a significant better solution after award, or they had legitimate reasons to tweak a solution given in the proposal. So we needed a way to allow these changes at the discretion of the department and also to be fair to the other proposals. Therefore, we added the CSI clause. So there is a question here about design refinement versus CSI. And I want to point out that our current policy, there is no design refinement. All changes after award will be processed as a CSI. So you either meet what's in the proposal or you process a CSI. Question number 11. What are some possible pitfalls after award? Two biggies are not giving up control and not holding design build firms to the requirements of the RFP or commitments made in the technical proposal. Certainly, it is important for all phase reviewers to review the component plans for conformance with the RFP, but also per the proposal. On the point about giving up control after award, I already covered the new policy for making phase review comments in the ERC system, which I think will help. Question number 12. As DOT component plan phase reviewer, what are FDOT's expectations regarding the depth of review to be performed on design build projects? The level of review for design build is similar as the level of review for conventional jobs. In both cases, beyond the minimum review that are performed on project submittals, the level of review varies greatly depending on certain red flags, which can indicate potential underlying design problems necessitating a more in-depth review. So what are some red flags indicating a more in-depth review is necessary? Here are a few items in the area of structures design. Roadway design have a similar list. When the engineers assigned to the job are not the engineers that qualify the firm for the specific work type. When the structure being proposed is more complex than necessary. When the structure being proposed is new and unproven or unusual. And I might point out here, you know, if you're proposing something in the technical proposal that we haven't seen built in Florida, you know, you need to spend a little extra time in the technical proposal to make us feel comfortable about it. You know, you need to try to cover some of the aspects that you think we might be concerned about. When general plan quality appears poor, apparent poor attention to QC indicates possible bigger issues. That's certainly true. When the proposed structure looks light based on experience, when the design does not compare well with other similar previous designs, or when typical design rules of thumb are violated. When the designer or firm has a poor track record regarding quality. So those are all red flags that we would look for, and when we do see those red flags, we do generally do a more in-depth review. So beyond the minimum depth of review that is performed on all projects, the depth of review on design build jobs should be exactly proportional to the quality of the submittal. And I might point out here too, and I know design build is a faster process with quicker turnaround times, probably on everybody's part. But we've been told by management to take a hard line. When submittals are incomplete, we've been told to send them back. So we need to work together here. But if what we want is to get to stamp those plans released for construction, it's really important that we get complete submittals in the phase reviews. Okay. Switching gears again. Whoops. Okay. The next series of slides outlines specific strategies for promoting flexibility in the design build or P3 procurement process. We have accumulated numerous examples through the years on how RFP language can promote designs that are different from the original concept or indicative plans, concepts that are in some cases have greater value and are less costly. 10 to 20% cost savings over what was shown in the concept plan estimate is not unusual. We have actually had a few instances where the best value proposal was more than 25% less than the concept plan estimated cost. However, I want to stress that this strategy requires a well-written RFP. It also likely requires support staff to evaluate proposed options during the ATC process, especially on large and complex jobs. As I mentioned earlier, writing an effective RFP is not an easy task. It involves clearly defining the constraints, scope of work, and functional requirements in such a way that promotes flexibility. Because authors of RFP are typically designers first and contract writers second, sharing these best practices through some actual examples, I hope, will be useful to the audience. And hopefully that'll better have you see how these best practices could be implemented. First and foremost, the RFP has to be clearly written. An RFP can be written with concise language while still allowing design flexibility. So I want to be very clear here. Don't confuse loose contract language with allowing design flexibility. The two are very different. Rule number 1. Do not describe the solution. Define the specific project requirements from which many acceptable project solutions can be developed. The first step in writing a successful RFP is to determine the functional requirements of the transportation facility. As I stated earlier, this means you have to remember why you did what you did when you developed the concept plans. And like I said, if the project's been around for many years, you may have to reevaluate earlier constraints and commitments to see if they're still valid. It has never been more important to document all project constraints and commitments on all job types, both conventional and design build, so that if a project gets converted from conventional to design build later, the RFP process is as seamless as possible. In many ways, writing an RFP is like writing a specification. You can be prescriptive and describe the single solution that meets the project needs. In the case of a specification, you would tell the contractor how to do something step by step. That would be prescriptive. Or you can be performance-based and write a specification which focuses on a successful outcome. An RFP is very similar. There actually may be project constraints that have to be prescriptive. More on that later. But the best practice is to use performance-based language whenever possible. Next, we're going to play the Gladiator game here. I will give you some sample RFP language on the next series of slides. For each, determine whether the RFP language is too prescriptive, thumbs down, or whether it properly defines functional requirements that allows for flexibility while ensuring an acceptable solution. Now, I want to point out here that these examples were taken from actual RFPs, but I've taken the liberty to change these for the purpose of training. So I'm going to not use the actual examples per se. Okay, let's get started. Example number 1, describe the minimum number of lanes at various locations and for various movements within the project. In this example, this exhibit was attached to the RFP and referenced as a requirement. So what do you think? Is this good? Yes, this would be considered an appropriate way of describing the operational requirements of the job. In this particular case, The final interchange solution looked quite different than the original indicative plan interchange layout depicted here. Although the final solution provided the same number of lanes for each ramp, main line, and local road, it was configured completely differently geometrically. Example number 2. Require specific aesthetic requirements for the various pier shapes. Based on input from project stakeholders, specific aesthetic requirements were agreed to. In this case, the RFP refers to this attachment showing these sketches as requirements. Any thoughts on this one? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Well, it turns out it depends. This is one of the few areas where a prescriptive approach is appropriate if, in fact, aesthetics is a real commitment. One note of caution here to ensure that you get what you want regarding pier shapes. Make sure that the family of pier shapes include all likely possibilities such as hammerhead, C-piers, straddle piers, because you got complicated geometrics that's going to force non-standard pier shapes. So make sure those are covered. Also, make sure the sketches adequately cover project variabilities such as wide bridges, narrow bridges, tall bridges, short bridges. So you need to do that. And you can see how in the slide here we've accommodated some of that. Okay, moving on. Example number 3. Describe the traffic connections that need to be accommodated, free flow versus signalized. So in this example, Washington Street and Adams Avenue are to be grade separated with no signals allowed. Any thoughts on this one? Yeah, this one's probably fine. Yeah, that's good. How about this one? Example number 4, describe the traffic connections that need to be accommodated. And let's assume here that there is also a statement regarding free flow versus signalized and stop condition requirements for these. It's quite a long list of connections, but yeah, this is a good one. This is how you do it. That's exactly what you want to do. How about this one? Example number 5, require a top-down construction approach in order to facilitate crane access and MOT. Any thoughts on this one? No, probably not a good example. The proper constraint here would be to include the traffic restrictions such as designating lane requirements during peak, non-peak, and nighttime operations, right? I will note, though, that there may be unusual cases where permitting, say on a water job with seagrass, is requiring top-down construction methods, but doing so would be an exception, not the rule. Another example may be where you're constructing a long segmental viaduct in the median of an interstate using span-by-span segmental construction. And because of crane access limitation, this solution may be required. But in this case, you may want to show the means and methods in your concept plans as a starting point and the requirements in the RFP regarding your traffic restrictions. So basically, you would just show one possible method, but you wouldn't require it. And that I think is the best approach. Okay. Example number 6. Specify all traffic control restrictions. In this case, the language is no lane closures are allowed on the project during the special events days previously listed in the RFP. State Road 15, Quincy Street, is designated a hurricane evacuation route. All lanes must be open to traffic 12 hours of a hurricane evacuation notice. Yeah, that's good. That's real good. Traffic restrictions are very valid. That's a good way of doing it. What about this one? Example 7, show in the technical proposal how the design will accommodate the ultimate build-out requirements. In this case, it says the design shall accommodate a future east-west transit corridor, including the construction of a future overpass at State Road 816. What about that one? Yeah, that's a very good example. You want to make sure that those future build-outs are accommodated, and they need to show those in the RFP. In their technical proposal. not only do they need to show their proposal, but they need to include the technical build or the full build outs as well. Example number 8. Require specific overpass configuration. In this case, the RFP is requiring a single point urban interchange at the intersection to comply with the approved environmental assessment. Probably not. A little bit too restrictive. Whereas the language may be perfectly accurate, the tone is probably too restrictive. An ATC could still entertain a change, right? But how would a proposed non-SPUE be evaluated? And how would an addendum have to be issued if another solution was accepted through the ATC process? The author of the RFP needs to foresee these possibilities in advance. And we're going to go through some slides on how this is done. And so they need to have a plan of how to address these. This is probably a little better example here. Example number 9, attaching the concept plans for information only and considering them as a starting point. So that's good. The horizontal layout must be per the geometry presented in the concept plans or an FDOT approved alternative technical concept. That's pretty good. Any thoughts? I'm going to say it depends. I don't know if we have enough information here to determine whether or not this is good or not. It is not adequate to simply state that you're entertaining options, right? You would have to have performance-based measures built into the RFP, and you would have to spell out how ATC geometric options would be evaluated, or you might hit a wall. And lastly, whether that geometric information will be shared in the RFP addendum to the other teams, I think is an important thing to consider. So we're getting a little bit closer here, but we're not quite there. How about this one? Oops. There we go. Example number 10. Attaching the concept plans as information only and considering them as a starting point, with the language that the operational capacity and level of service of any proposed geometric changes must be equal to or better than the capacity and level of service provided in the concept plans. That sounds pretty good. With the stipulation that any ATC approved geometry would include a traffic analysis comparing both. So you would require, if they changed the geometry, they would have to submit the traffic analysis to show that it worked equal to or better. Any thought about that? So now we're starting to get pretty close. The trick is to make sure that the use in the traffic analysis software is being used correctly and consistently, right? We still haven't answered the question of whether we would exempt out approved geometric ATCs from having to share them through an addendum. Some districts have very successfully exempted out this information from the ATC process, but all of the non-geometric aspects of the approved ATC would still be shared with you through an addendum, okay? So here's an example that does just that. Number 11, example number 11, horizontal and vertical geometry. Notice here that all questions have been answered. How the geometric changes would be evaluated, where they would be evaluated, in this case it says through an ATC. And lastly, it exempts out geometric ATCs from disclosure in an amended RFP. Get with your individual districts for input on whether to divulge geometric approved ATCs. As I indicated, this preference can vary from district to district. Just remember, you have to have a performance-based RFP to make this work. And so, yes, thumbs up on this one. That's a good example. This is one more geometric-related example, Example number 12. Fix the horizontal alignment. Here it is not even clear how or where the geometric changes would be vetted or approved. So no, without knowing more about this, this is probably not a very good way to go. So we would say thumbs down on this one, right? Okay. We're almost done. Example number 13. Setting minimum bridge lengths. Any thoughts on this one? Here we are setting maximum begin bridge stations and minimum end bridge stations. Yeah, it's probably okay, assuming that the bridge length is tied to a real constraint. Examples may include to facilitate a future road widening underneath, to facilitate canal maintenance access, or to prohibit really high retaining walls. But think about it, in this case, the preferred method would actually be to directly set the maximum wall height. It wouldn't be to set the bridge lengths. So there's probably a better way to do it than set bridge stations. Just tell them that the maximum height of the walls can't get over 35 feet or whatever the number is. Okay. That's pretty much all I had. One thing I did want to cover has to do with addressing design build teams' questions during the procurement process. And I wanted to point out that before advertisement, there is no problems with answering questions related to consultants and contractors' questions, okay? But once the advertisement starts, that department folks have to be very careful in how they answer questions. And if the question is simply an interpretation of the policy, that's okay to answer. You can simply say, if the question is, I'm not sure what the policy is on this, you can give them a reference in the SDG or the PPM. And you can even tell them to the extent, you know, that what the interpretation means. That's okay. But anything beyond that, the consultant needs to follow the RFP requirements as it relates to interaction with the department. So if they're asking you for a preference, you can't answer that. And so it's a little bit tricky when you're taking questions. It works out pretty good up here because we're so involved in the projects. When we get a question up here, we usually know, just by the questioning on what they're talking about or getting at. And so we can ask them about the specifics of the job. And that's the proper thing to do is if there's some question, just say, is this project specific and is it design build? And then lead them in the right direction regarding the proper channels. So just a word of caution there, especially for you folks in central office and folks that are further away from the project than the district. Be careful about entertaining questions during procurement. And that's all I had.